Hey, good afternoon. My name's Jesse Meyer. I'm here for Project 2. So we're going to be going over a lot of stuff we covered here in Module 3, Module 4. What you see in front of you on this slide right here is the alligator lizard. One of my favorite lizards. I like them because they're in my garden. They eat slugs, they eat snails, so they're good for pest control, good to have around. They can be a little feisty, so I've read, but when I've seen them, they generally been fairly docile. And yeah, I figure I'd start off with just a little critter that I enjoy. All right, moving on to the next slide. All right, so I'm going to be going over body plan, locomotion, limbs, movement, skeletal structures. That's what I chose previously in my project. So that's what I have here. Okay, this is some of the things we're going to be covering here. You can see a milk steak there. Again, I like to put critters that I enjoy and like there. So this is all we're going to be covering here. I'm going to be speaking to a lot of these, all of these in much more detail as we go on. All right, so jumping into it, Porolepiformes. I'm gonna jump into that. So these are near shore freshwater. We're looking at the Devonian period from 416 to 359 million years ago. Again, we're gonna get a little more into it, but just to give you the basics here of what we're getting into. Now, during this time period, what was going on in the environment? We had shallow water, we had low oxygen levels. So the environment, you can think of it, it's swampy, not a lot of oxygen. So fish, anything with gills is not gonna, there's not gonna be a ton of oxygen available. So you start having fish, particularly the lobefin fishes, starting to come in more towards shore. And they're a little different. They have the lobe fins. They're able to navigate shallower waters a little bit better. They also have lungs to where they can utilize some of that oxygen in these low oxygen environments. So speaking to these in particular, they have long, fleshy pectoral fins, good for a walking-like motion and amphibious potential. So basically, what we're looking at fish. We got a low oxygen environment. They're starting to come into the shallower waters where maybe there's more food, starting to explore new food resources. They have lungs, and that's where we're at for now. Moving on, we have Elpis toastii gids. That's late Devonian, 385 to 375 million years ago. Again, the environment we're looking at, it's going to be shallow, low oxygen, also cluttered substrates. So you could have some leaves falling on from the shore, and they're falling into there, and they're creating a lot of areas where there's now a prey-rich environment, so to speak. So they can forage around those areas and find food. So these have a pectoral fin, four rows of radials, fin rays, and bony digits that would help them push off that substrate. So again, it's similar to before. They're coming into these shallow areas. They're looking for food in those areas, maybe escaping predators in these areas as well. And they're branching out, exploring new resources, and basically selection is favoring these traits in these situations. What traits would those be? Again, that's going to be fins are turning into more, instead of things propel you through the water, it's the sort of thing that's going to be able to start pushing you around those shallower areas. Now, another thing about these, we have neck head mobility due to the lost opercular bone. And so that's kind of a big one. What that would allow them to do, that allows them to move their head around a little bit more, look for prey. They're not just having to shift their whole body. They're able to sit in a position, look, observe their surroundings, and that doesn't seem like much, but that's a pretty significant adaptation because that starts leading to a better ability to find prey, a better ability to avoid predation, and then navigate their new environments that they're starting to come into. All right, next, we're going to be talking about Tiktaalik. That's about 375 million years ago. So this is a key transitional species. You can see the picture of it here on the screen. And again, that's speaking to what we're talking about. We got these swamp-like environments, these shallow environments. It still has a tail you can see, but it's able to start navigating the aquatic and the terrestrial environments a little bit more. I would think of it almost crocodilian like, not in how it would behave. Is that's how I'd imagine, anyways. If you look at the eyes, it's got a flattened skull shape. The eyes are on top, so that'd be good for peering above the water while remaining hidden. Good for ambushes. Good also for remaining concealed, but still situational awareness, what's going on there. So again, as far as these environments we're looking at, same what we're talking about before, shallow, oxygen poor environments, that's bringing them into these behaviors, but then you're starting to get in the physiology to back up these behaviors because selection is favoring that more and more and more. And so things begin to develop more towards the terrestrial side. Not, I wouldn't say more towards, but they're starting to shift in that direction a little bit. Another thing about this particular animal, you have ribs supported out of water. So as it starts coming out of water, you no longer have that water supporting all that weight. Now you have gravity pulling down a little more. So the skeletal structure needs to shift to match that. So ribs are a key development here to support that extra weight as it comes out of the water. And then why though? Access new food resources. So coming out of the aquatic environment, you have a whole untapped reserve of food resources out there that they're hooking into and able to do now. All right, now moving on to Ichthyostegu. So that 360 to 370 million years ago. So this is considered an early walker, powerful forelimbs, able to lift the torso, have an inchworm-like motion. Rib cage is robust, prevents the lungs from being crushed, like we were talking about. Reinforced spine, 7-digit rear limbs, paddle-like. Same environment like we were talking about before. So I list off these facts to reinforce the why, though. The why, again, starting to move out of that aquatic environment, searching for new food, maybe avoiding predators, but selection is obviously favoring this at this point in time. These animals would have been, 70 to 90% in water and then the rest of the time out of water. But that physiology is starting to react to what selection is favoring at this point in time, which is leaving the water more. So we're starting to see that more. All right, moving on to Acanthostega. This is a fishapod, as it's known, 365 million years ago. So this is Devonian swamp periods. Again, something to keep in mind, deciduous plants are flourishing at this time. So you have leaves dropping near the shore, lots of room for little things to get in there that they like to eat. So this is a good feeding ground, which is probably why they're being drawn into it. One key thing about this is, unlike fish, the pelvis is attached to the backbone. So that's another key development there as the physiology is starting to shift a little more towards the terrestrial. It did have a fish-like tail. Okay, moving on to the next slide here. So here, we're going to continue to talk about the traits, how they were adapted, and what is happening in the environment. Again, this is the key why as to what's going on here. You can see a picture of a reptiliomorph. So that's an amphibian. I'll get into that a little bit more, but I'm going to touch on the others before I jump into that too much. So tetrapods, I've already been talking about those. These are fish to walkers, so to speak. Skeletons adapting, heavier to support the terrestrial. Distinct necks are key traits here. And then amphibians. Amphibians are going to be what is gearing towards from the aquatic to the terrestrial. So this is going to be the mid to late Devonian, 415 to 355 million years ago. Lobe-finned fish ancestors, undulating motion initially, where the habitat, those shallow waters we're talking about, drying waters, drying areas. So as we shift to amphibians, it becomes a little bit more beneficial to move around more. And we start seeing a shift towards limbs too. Limbs are easier to navigate some of these marshy sort of areas and areas that dry out sometime with brush and leaves. They can get through that better, forage better. And the name of the game is food, eat, survive, avoid predation, and selection is starting to favor these characteristics with amphibians. And then from the amphibians, we get the reptiliomorphs. This is where literally means like reptile-like, reptile-shaped. So Similar to aquatic Devonians, they're similar to the first, they're kind of like a bridging the gap between the first reptiles and then some of these first Devonian creatures that are starting to come out of the water. Limb placement, there's a slight shiftment, a more efficient gait, and a key thing here too, though it doesn't really deal with skeletal structure, is amniotes. These are some of the earliest amniotes, which is really the heavy transition towards the terrestrial realm, where you start getting eggs that can keep water from evaporating out. Now, that doesn't have much to do with skeletal structure, so I won't go into that too much. But again, this is the reptiliomorphs are a huge key transition point when we're getting talking about going fully terrestrial. All right, moving on. All right, Testadunes and Squamata. All right, so we some of those pictures we can see there. That's a basilisk lizard. Um, Pretty fascinating animal. They can go bipedal when they're threatened and trying to get away. And then we see a good old alligator snapping turtle there. I throw that on there because I'm from Kansas. I've seen these things. I love them because they're crazy animals. They're excellent ambush predators. They can live extremely long periods of time. And as you see, they get absolutely massive. I'd never mess with one like that. I leave them alone. Let that guy do what he does. Yeah, it's not my thing. But moving on, as far as Testadunes, that's easily distinguishable because those are turtles. They have shells. Now, whatever those shells, those are the ribs fused together, and then the spine is also fused with that. We have the plastron and the carapace. Plastron below, the carapace up top. It's a skeletal home. It helps them avoid predation. It limits their speed um, in some cases. The caveat to that, you have soft shell turtles, aquatic ones. They have thinner shells. They're going to be a little more aerodynamic in the water, generate less drag. Aquatic turtles have flippers to locomote themselves, so they can get around a little better like that. Whereas your alligator snapping turtle, it doesn't really have flippers. It's got its claws. It's not necessarily swimming anywhere. It's more just kind of like moving around, waiting and ambushing prey. And then, but what led turtles to become that way? There's still not fully known. Potentially burrowing initially to avoid predation, and then over time, they kind of develop their own defensive home in a way. So instead of burrowing, they literally had become a burrow in themselves. And then the earliest turtles, they couldn't retract their head into their shell, but later turtles were able to, modern turtles as we know them can bring their head into their shell to protect themselves. As far as squamata, that's going to be our lizards and snakes. So that's a highly movable skull. Limb reduction, you're looking at that with snakes and even some lizards. Undulating motion initially, bipedal, as you can see in the picture. Snakes, there's many different ways they locomote themselves, to include sidewinding with some of your desert species to avoid overheating and prolonged contact with that hot sand. And what I'm getting at with snakes and lizards and then turtles too is we're getting into very diverse habitats. We're terrestrial here at this point in time. What led us there? Food, resources, coming on the land to harvest untapped resources. And then as they hit land, they spread out to all these different ecosystems and biomes. And then selection favors certain traits in each of these. And then you start getting that massive diversity that we see with snakes, with lizards, and then even turtles as well. So that's kind of what drove them to where they were. They finally caught onto land, got into our amniotes. And then after that, many different environments, adaptations to those environments over time, different ways to locomote through those environments as well. All right, this is what I picked from Module 3. This is the Eryops. You can see a picture of what a skeletal structure looks like, and that's what I'm going to highlight. The key to adaptation is a robust skeletal structure. I think that shows it pretty well if you can see it over there. Extremely sturdy limbs, strong vertebrae column. It's massive. It would not have been fast, likely. It would have been very strong, very slow, more than likely. Probably an apex predator. There wouldn't have been many things that that would have been able to take this thing down. It would have likely been towards the top of the food chain. Um, and then what I find interesting about this adaptation is it's look at that skeletal structure, the way it's adapted to this thing being on land. Everything's sturdier, everything's more reinforced. It's like an engineer. If you had an aquatic animal, like what can I do to make it come onto land? Let's make everything beefier and bigger. That's what happened here. It would have likely hunted at the water's edge, and then as far as what make these adaptations unique, again, it's lifestyle, and then selection favoring certain traits repeated on itself over and over and over, and with time you get this creature that comes out of the water very sturdy as a result. All right, I'm gonna move along. I'm probably getting pretty far along on time here, so I don't want to go too far over here, but I do want to hit everything in as much detail as possible. Lastly, we got the American bullfrog. I picked this again. I'm from Kansas. You hear these in farm ponds everywhere. Some people don't like them. They're considered invasive in some areas, but I really like them. What I find unique about them, their song. It's very different than a lot of frogs. Earlier in our lesson, we had all those frog calls we could listen to. Nothing really sounds like this. They call it jug-o-rum, jug-o-rum. That's kind of what it sounds like when it makes the noise. What's it for? Advertise for mating, territorial with other bullfrogs, and yes, it can scream too when threatened. So it has a diverse vocal capability. One interesting thing about this is noise pollution. They can actually adapt their calls to noise pollution. They can shift the pitch, shift their timing to stand out when there's noise pollution. Long distance, it's a very, very low call, but it can go a very long distance, up to half a mile. That's part of what I find so unique about these is their adaptation to their surroundings too. They can even synchronize. So most people, they hear it, they think of the sound, but in reality, the bullfrog can adapt its call quite a bit. And your average person will never hear that, but they can do it so that other frogs can hear it. All right, and that's gonna bring me mostly to the end. Again, I just want to summarize everything. It's going from aquatic to terrestrial. What does that mean? Low oxygen, swampy environments. You're coming in closer to land, chasing food resources, starting to use those lungs more for air. And then you get into amphibious animals, early reptiliomorphs, amniotes. From amniotes, then we're getting into our lizards, our turtles, and then from there on, we're branching out. All right, that's all I got. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a good evening.